when do we then start seeing this pattern that you're bordering onto the harmful side of things?
Some people say an organization is communication and communication is an organization.
Yes, yeah.
I think we're at that crossroads where we need to now be talking more about harm reduction and harm minimization and prevention.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Comms Hub, your go-to space for all things PR, digital marketing and media relations. My name is Lebogang Seoheng, Senior PR Account Executive at Tishala Communications, and I'm your host for today. In a world where gambling is becoming increasingly accessible, understanding its impact and how we communicate around it has never been more important. Today's conversation is about the power of strategic communication in driving awareness, shifting perception, and promoting responsible behavior. And to join us to unpack all of this is Lebogang Seoheng, who is Advocacy, Communication and Prevention Manager at the South African Responsible Gambling Foundation. Lebo has been Advocacy and Communications Manager at the Foundation for 5 years now. He has 18 years experience in practicing strategic public relations, communications and corporate social responsibility for private and public sector brands. He holds a BA degree in corporate communication, majoring in communication and psychology from the University of Johannesburg. His passion lies in developmental communication and advocating for change. Lebo, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having us.
Welcome to the Comms Hub. Finally,
we are here.
We are here. And I think, as I said in the beginning, it is today's conversation is about the power of strategic communication, your forte, your expertise. And I think if we can kick off, Lebo, in defining, how do we define problem gambling and gambling related harm? Let's start with those definitions because we assume the public knows these.
Absolutely. I think, when it comes to gambling or engaging in the activity of gambling, a lot of people think, but why would one get addicted to gambling? I mean, if it's too much, you simply stop. And a lot of people don't understand what happens in the mind, in the brain, which influences how we feel and how we behave and how we act, which is very critical and important. And I think, yes, problem gambling, gambling disorder, gambling addiction, very technical, clinical, medical terms, but let me just bring it or break it down just to make it practical in terms of that, and I'll bring it back into problem gambling. Let's take coffee, for example, that we have. We love coffee, it gives us energy, we start the day with it. But, as you engage in your first cup of coffee, some people feel that it's not enough. It's a busy day, you're drained, you want another cup of coffee. And then as that happens, and as that feeling that the brain kind of has, I'm feeling drained, I'm feeling down, I need a bit of a pick-me-up. So the brain says, have a cup of coffee. Because you've conditioned the brain to say, that's my pick-me-up solution. Now, there's nothing wrong in drinking coffee. And I mean, Lesego can have 10 cups of coffee, Lebo can have 2 cups of coffee. But the distinguisher when it becomes an addiction to coffee or reliance to coffee, it's when your brain keeps telling you, have that cup of coffee, have that cup of coffee. And then as you increase your intake, so let's take, maybe you say you have 4 cups of coffee a day, 1 in the morning when you wake up, mid-morning, afternoon, and in the evening. It's not about necessarily the frequency, but now what happens is because you start building tolerance in your brain, so it becomes 1 scoop of caffeine or 1 scoop of coffee. Then you start doing 2 scoops of coffee in that one, and then it's 3 scoops because your brain is telling you, I need more, I want that feeling, and then you start building up tolerance. Now, when we bring it back to gambling, it's the same thing that happens. So you will then first try it out with a 50 Rand. And from that 50 Rand, you win 200 Rand. And as that happens, what's happening in the brain is that there are chemicals called dopamine that are being released. And dopamine is a feel-good hormone. So a lot of people want to chase that feeling and that rush that they felt when they won. So yes, the secondary is the money that you're getting, but then ultimately what's happening in the brain, it's being altered in a way. And so a lot of people start chasing the feeling of winning rather than the actual money. And then as you build tolerance, 50 Rand, you don't want to win 200 Rand anymore, you want to win 2,000 Rand. 2,000 Rand is not enough, you want to win 20,000 Rand. You want to win 200,000 Rand, 2 million Rand. And then you start increasing your stakes, and then that's when it becomes a little bit problematic when you can't afford to do it. So I think it's just understanding the nature and the risk that one is getting to, but also understanding what is happening in my mind. How is it altering my behavior? And is it taking me away from my day-to-day routine? Is that all one thinks about all day? So I think it's important to understand it from that perspective. But again, Lesego, just in terms of just bringing analogy into it to explain it, is that there are some people who are predisposed to certain things. If we look at it in the physiological or health sector or health space, if you have a family history of diabetes or cancer, what you would do is you would do lifestyle changes. You'll do regular physiological checks to check, you know what I mean, how you are from a health perspective. And with that genetic predisposition, you know how to manage and alter your lifestyle, what to eat, what to do, the do's and don'ts. But then there are just some people who are genetically predisposed to addiction, generally. And depending on how they are socialized in their family unit, it then dictates what type of addiction they get addicted to. So if it's coffee, and you were, as a young child, socialized that every morning you make mom or dad a cup of coffee, it's a modeling behavior. You adapt to that. And then as you grow up, you then know that I have to start the morning with a cup of coffee. And so, again, coffee can then be addiction. But not coffee itself, but caffeine within the coffee, which has a physiological impact on that. Same thing applies with gambling. So if you are socialized and normalized in gambling within the home space, and it's stimulated through advertising, and it's stimulated through what you see and the culture behind it, it then becomes, you become at risk. So people that are genetically predisposed to addiction are a high risk factor. Other people who are also at high risk are those that have got psychological comorbidities. Now, in South Africa, we have a thing about mental health, but the tide is turning slowly but surely in terms of recognizing the importance of mental health and mental wellness and taking care of your mind, because your mind feeds your body. And, you know, some people are diagnosed with depression, anxiety, sleep disorders, bipolar, schizophrenia, and those people are at high risk as well when they start engaging in the activity, because naturally what happens in the brain and the neurological pathway. Others are undiagnosed but are engaging in the activity. So the same way we go for our dental checks, our dermatological tests, optometry checks, we need to do the same if you're engaging in gambling, so that you're able to know whether you're at risk or not, and not at the point where you've lost everything financially, your family unit, your family home has broken, and you're literally at a point where you just want to commit suicide. So it's as we would naturally do for physiological health, we should be doing for gambling, for those that do participate in gambling.
And that's entering that gray area now between recreational gambling and harmful gambling behavior.
Absolutely.
And that's where you come in. Because we have got viewers who go, oh, but I gamble recreationally. I was there just last month, you know. I'm not there this month. When do we then start seeing this pattern that you're bordering onto the harmful side of things?
Absolutely. I think because gambling is a behavior, it's not a substance abuse where you know that I've had too many cups of coffee, I'm getting heart palpitations, your body is telling you that no more. But with gambling, you start to see it through change of behavior. Naturally, the brain builds tolerance. And as I mentioned before, it's 1 cup, then it's 2 cups, then it's 3 cups. Then you keep it at 3 cups, but then you add more scoops of coffee, because your tolerance is saying 1 scoop is not enough, I need 2 or 3. And once you start seeing that from a gambling perspective, when you start spending more time than you usually do, when you start spending more money that you usually do, when you start using money that was meant for other household commitments, that's when you start to know that something is wrong here. And it's at that point you need to seek help, because it's easier to reverse you back to a recreational social gambler at that point, rather at the point where you've now developed comorbidity conditions because you've lost everything, therefore you start drinking more and you start drinking heavily. You become indebted because now you've maxed out all your credit cards. Your house is about to be repossessed because you haven't paid your rent, you haven't paid your bond, and all of that. So it's very critical at that point where you know yourself and you know when you are stepping out of the limits. It's that point where you need to reach help, because it's easier to then, through counseling and treatment, be able to give you the tools to be able to then reverse you back into a behavior that is manageable.
Advocacy, Lebo, is a key part of the foundation's work, of your work. How do you use strategic communication to influence both public understanding and policy conversations around responsible gambling?
I think communication plays a very key role. I think some people say an organization is communication and a communication is an organization.
Yes.
It plays a very critical role in many ways, in many facets. I mean, the first one is, if you break it down further in the gambling space, it's the person who's engaging in the activity, the actual gambling, in terms of what does it mean, what are the risks, and also to empower them with that information so that they know what risk they are taking. That part of communication is in terms of making them understand what is a social gambler, when you're doing it safely, when does it then convert? So understanding when the shift and the change then happens and empowering them with that knowledge. Also for them to understand what's happening in their brain, because our brains are in our heads. We don't physically see them when this dopamine is being excreted, but then it does influence the behavior. So as soon as people understand, but why am I feeling this way today? Why am I feeling? It's because there are things that are happening in the brain in which people need to understand how to balance that out. So it plays a very key role in making people, empowering people to understand the activity or the risk they're putting themselves in. The other aspect of it is also in the gambling space, we have what we call the punter, which is the person that gambles or wagers. Then there's the operator. That's the person that gets the license and they offer the different betting and gambling modes. They also have a responsibility to protect you as a punter. So we call that player protection, because the one aspect of responsibility of comms or information sharing sits with the gambler, but then the other part of communication sits with the operator, because they need to communicate to you as their punter or as their client or as their customer to say, do it within your means, budget, wager what you can afford, know when to stop. And understanding the risks of engaging in the activity. And then there's another aspect of communication which comes from the regulators, or what we call the gambling boards, because they have public interest at heart. Yes, they need to generate revenue coming from the industry, but they need to protect and look at the socio-economic impact of that. And so they also have a role of communicating. So the communication can't just be sitting with the South African Responsible Gambling Foundation through the NRGP, but the custodians who have the licenses need to do that, and the custodians who issue out the license need to do that, and therefore it needs to become a collaborative way of communicating the same message. But in order to do that, we need to have a shared understanding of what is problem gambling, and what is responsible gambling, and how much is too much. And if we don't have that shared meaning and shared understanding, it means that we'll be communicating the same thing, but in different ways, and it will have different meanings and be interpreted differently. So one of the things that we are advocating for is for shared understanding and meaning for when we say responsible gambling, what does it practically look like? When we talk about problem gambling, what is it? And what does it look like, and what shape and form it takes? And then once we start from there, then we're able to then communicate in our different ways. The advantage that operators have from a communications perspective is because they deal directly with the punters. They've got their cell phone numbers, they've got their ID numbers, they've got their email addresses. So they, in terms of communication touch points, they have got the direct communication touch point. Whereas on our side, we rely on media platforms in terms of editorials and advertorials. We rely on social media, websites, podcasts, etc., to relay the message broadly at a mass level. But at that individual level, the operators actually have that, and they should be maximizing that, because a social gambler is a healthy gambler is a social gambler, and that is healthy for the gambling ecosystem because they're a repeat client and a repeat customer, and they're not burdening the healthcare space in terms of first addiction, but also comorbidity conditions, and it doesn't then impact other sectors such as banks, which we owe credit to. I mean, retailers have been complaining that groceries have people, there are less groceries in the basket now than there was a couple of years ago because people are wanting to bet. So I think, I think as the custodian of responsible gambling or problem gambling and providing counseling and treatment, we need to be the drivers of it. But then we also need other partners and stakeholders to come in and communicate from the same base point. Yeah.
Indeed, which brings me to the next point of shifting that public perception, right? Because we've got the stigma attached to problem gambling. But what do you think needs to change in how society understands gambling harm? Do you think you're communicating the same song with the industry, with operators and industry players? Are you communicating the same messaging? Are you saying the same thing, or are you losing the public somewhere? How do we communicate effectively to shift that narrative?
Absolutely, Lesogha. That's a great question. I think when you come to the stigma side of things, I think we need to look at it broadly, not just from a gambling addiction point of view, but just a general South African mental health, just generally in terms of understanding my mental health, understanding where am I in terms of my psychological health. And the only way to do that is to seek counseling, is to seek treatment, so that you know whether you are at risk or whether I could be sitting here happy and jolly, but I could have a depression undiagnosed. And then when I engage in other activities such as gambling, I'm not aware of how the two meet and the impact when the two meet together. So I think from a stigma perspective, I think we need to have more conversations about just general mental health and mental well-being. Because once we understand that and people seek counseling and talk to psychologists and counselors, they then begin to understand where they are sitting in terms of their mental health and well-being. So that when they engage in certain activities, whether it's drinking of alcohol, whether it's drinking of coffee, whether it's gambling, then you know where you stand and what are the risks associated with where you are. When it comes to communicating the message, are we communicating the same message? Yes and no. Yes, in the part of we talk about responsible gambling, but then what is it in practical terms? From a mental health perspective, we'll tell you what responsible gambling is. But then from an operator perspective who offer the gambling games, they need to tell you what that means from a wagering perspective, what that means. So I think we don't have a unified unified way of communicating what responsible gambling is. Another thing that we've found or we've observed as an institution is that the gambling industry is very shy in acknowledging the harm that their products and services actually create. The liquor industry are not the saints in all of this, but at least they've gotten to a point where they actually acknowledge that don't drink and drive. You know what I mean? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
They when it comes to festive season or holiday seasons, they encourage people to arrive alive, don't drink and drive. Drink responsibly, and they've taken a stance to actually acknowledge that our product actually does cause harm if it's used excessively. Whereas in the gambling industry, we haven't gotten to that point where operators can honestly have a conversation with their customers to say, look, engage in our activity, engage in our games, but know the risks that come with it. And if you do find yourselves at that point, these are the avenues you can take
Yes.
for rehabilitation and realignment. So I think we're slowly getting there. I think we are getting to a tipping point in the industry where it can't be swept under the carpet anymore. We need to have a conversation about the risks
Indeed.
that are associated with that. Yeah.
Sure. On access to help. For individuals and families affected by gambling harm, Lebo, access to help is critical. Talk us through how the foundation ensures that your messaging and your work reaches vulnerable people in a way that is both accessible and meaningful. You don't want for someone to feel like the help is there and I can't get there, I can't reach them. How does, take us through the messaging and the work that you do reaches community both in a meaningful way and in an accessible way?
I think, it's quite and because we deal with such a diverse group of people, or that we need to communicate anything from literally primary school kids all the way up to, senior citizens that are on pension. And also different cultures, different creeds. It's not just the lower LSMs, it's the higher LSM levels. It is quite a diverse group of people that we need to, but we need to then also just dissect in terms of, we need to meet them where they are. I think that's the most critical part of any communication campaign, is meet your audience where they are. And where they are in the space of gambling is, you're going to find them at the casinos, at the bingo outlets, at the sports tournaments. That's where you're going to find them. And so we need to find those touch points where we meet them where they are and be able to communicate and give them the message and empower them. Now, when it comes to help and treatment and counseling, it's voluntary. And it's a journey, because for a person to acknowledge that they have a problem, or to get them to a point for counseling and treatment, I have to self-acknowledge that I have a problem. And in order to reach that, I need to have a conversation with somebody that will steer me to show me that, you know what, I think I have a problem and I think I need help. So it's very difficult because we're dealing with human behavior. And I mean, gambling disorder, or problem gambling being a mental health disorder, is a very nuanced, so what works for Lebo might not work for Lesego. So, but meeting people where they are is one aspect of communicating effectively. Communicating in mother tongue is very important as well. We throw big jargons, big words, gambling disorder, addiction, mental
Gambling
health,
harm.
dopamine, gambling harm, and also just practicalizing some of these phenomena and dynamics in terms of this addiction practically, so people can understand and resonate with it. That's the one aspect of it. Another would be obviously the traditional ways as comms practitioners, the press releases, the interviews, the podcasts, and all of that, the earned and the owned media that we use. But also, again, most importantly, would be also to, start I don't want to say centralize, but then the fragmentation that's happening in the industry where, the operator saying that, the regulator saying that, the South African Responsible Gambling Foundation is saying that. So us getting just a unified understanding and platform in terms of norms and standards and principles, in terms of how do we communicate, how do we advertise, because that proliferation of advertising is a lot, it's everywhere, and I think it's overstimulated, and obviously with overstimulation means more people are going to engage with it, and if people don't understand the risks in terms of that, it becomes it becomes very difficult for communicators to be able to get the message out there if we're not having that unified standpoint.
Indeed. And looking at stakeholder engagement, we know the ecosystem involves regulators, operators. How do you foresee yourself working together with stakeholders, and how, while maintaining your mandate of advocacy as the foundation, how, take us through that? Do you foresee more engagement with stakeholders? Take us through some
Absolutely.
of plans that you may have, from that.
I think stakeholder engagement is very, very critical. I mean, we can't do this alone. You've got the operators who've got a role to play in terms of player protection. You've got the regulators or the gambling boards who issue the licenses, who also need to balance economic development, job creation, together with mental health and the harm that it creates, and also make sure that the operators comply to what's in the law, and police them and find them and call them to account where they see that they are deviating away from that. But besides the direct people within the gambling ecosystem, other stakeholders have got a role to play. The banks have got a role to play, because if people are indebted, they can't pay back their credit. Retailers have got a role to play because they sell betting vouchers in their retail stores. Mental health. The mental health fraternity and the health fraternity also have got, because remember, it's a mental health behavioral disorder, but has physiological effects. So are we not burdening the public health sector for those that are not on medical aid, and especially those that are in gambling? Because they are indebted, they must probably, their medical aids have lapsed. So the stakeholder ecosystem has grown. It's beyond just because of the significant growth of the gambling industry based on the gross gambling revenue that comes out and the numbers of people that are gambling. It means that stakeholders need to come together to be able to at least try and stabilize the situation, so that we don't find ourselves at a tipping point with behavioral disorders in the country, which have a financial impact in terms of how we operate as humans and as an ecosystem.
Yeah. And to close it off, Lebo, the future of responsible gambling communication. Looking ahead, what opportunities do you see more for impactful communication, right, in this space? And what role should organizations like the SARGF play? What more do you want to see?
I think the conversation is going to move away from responsible gambling. I think we're at that crossroads where we need to now be talking more about harm reduction and harm minimization and prevention to harm, rather than doing it responsibly or get the help once the harm has been created. So a lot more communication is going to be a very preventative communication that needs to be communicated out there in the different ways and different forums, and also just educating people about the harm, because I think a lot of people just are not understanding that. We talk about gambling responsibly, we talk about time limits, budgets, and all of those things, but then we need to now start educating and communicating to people about the mental and the physiological effects of engaging in it, so they can make informed decisions whether they want to gamble or not. But yeah, I think that's going to be very critical and key going forward into the future, and really just solidifying our stance as an industry and as a sector towards it, and not sweeping things under the carpet, and just leaving it to one entity to deal with it, where it needs a multi-pronged approach with various stakeholders.
Sure. Lebo, thank you so much for such an insightful conversation. I think what really stands out is the critical role that organizations like the South African Responsible Gambling Foundation play, not only in advocacy and communication, but in shifting perceptions and driving awareness and promoting responsible gambling behavior. Thank you all so much for tuning in. Thank you, Lebo, for coming through. And do check us out. Do share, like, and subscribe, of course.